Anime character poses are quite exaggerated in their body positions, as they are often drawn in unique fighting styles. Anime anatomy follows the same rules of normal anatomical proportions to that of normal human anatomy. However, we can play around with deviating from these proportions to create more nuanced movements within our anime character designs. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics, and in today's video we will be looking at how to draw different anime poses. Now, we don't necessarily need too many fancy materials. We will be working with the basic kind of structural drawing process of how to shape anime characters, so you can work with any simple drawing materials such as pencils, paintbrushes, or whatever you have available to you. Now, in this tutorial we will explore some basic concepts of anatomy, perspective, proportions in various cute anime poses, and once you understand the fundamentals of anime character poses through some preliminary sketches and practice, the process of applying them to various anime character designs will become much easier. So we will also explore shading and tonal variation through various colors and how this affects the overall design of various anime body positions. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to start by understanding unique anime poses. So we want to first develop some anime pose reference drawings by going through some fundamental concepts. We want to understand concepts of proportion, shape, and form. So the way in which we're going to start is we're going to start by first breaking down what exactly are proportions, or just understanding human proportions. Now, we first want to understand some general proportional rules that are basically used within anime character design. So anime anatomy is no different from normal human anatomy. The human body is basically described as a structure that can be divided into 8 equal parts, known as the rule of 8. Now, the head of any figure, as you basically start by dividing the body into 8 equal parts for both male and female, these 8 equal parts are the same, but the way in which we decide the actual length of these 8 equal parts is always determined by the size of the head. From there, the head will basically establish the length of the remaining 7 segments that break up the body into these 8 equal parts. So as we basically work our way down to the body, we will find that the pubic area will always break up the 4 different segments that establish both the top and bottom sections of the anatomy. That being said, with anime character poses, we can always start with the basic proportions, with normal human basic proportions, as a point of reference to then play around with how we deviate these characteristics to represent different anime character designs, which takes us into the next stage, and that is manipulating proportions for unique character design. Now, the fun begins when we can now play around with manipulating the rules of 8 and the proportions to suit our character design. A good suggestion is to always start with simplistic poses in the beginning, giving you a basic sense of how to use this rule of 8 for very simple positions in the body. Now, by starting with simple poses such as a standing pose, you can make minor adjustments to get a sense of how it affects the aesthetic of the character, naturally by distorting the figure in very subtle ways. This will kind of give you a sense of how you can actually deviate from the basic anatomical rules of a human or a normal human anatomy. So now, working with simple forms does give you that kind of practice to get comfortable with it, but it also gives you a moment to understand points of mobility in the body, where the knees bend, the ankles bend, maybe where the elbows bend, the body bends forward, and so on. Now, the more comfortable we get with the sense of proportions, the better our understanding of light and shadow will be as well, which becomes a crucial element in defining the structure of the body. Now, this is no different for anime structures, because this is a great way to once again define our characters in different types of lighting, which can be something that makes them seem more heroic, something that makes them seem more timid, but lighting does give us a sense of how shadow does bring more shape to the body, which ultimately just makes the figure slightly more nuanced and more realistic simply in their form and proportions. Now, we need to construct a figure first before we can understand the placement of shading to represent shadow formation. So naturally, understanding proportion does help us to understand the structure of different bodily features, and therefore where shadows will be established along those various surface areas. Now, the other thing we want to break down is perspective. So once you have gotten comfortable, there are a few ways to approach drawing characters from unique perspectives. Now, there are many ways to do this, and one of the most effective ways is to basically compartmentalize different features in a box-like format. So by utilizing the rule of 8 segments, you can form these different sized boxes to understand the scale and shape of different body parts depending on the angle. Now, naturally, this is very useful for understanding figures that are kind of drawn in a cinematographically kind of way, where basically the angles are very intense in a way that seems like it's from a movie. So basically what we do is we utilize the rule of eights or those segments where you basically form these different size boxes to understand the scale and the shape of different body parts depending on the unique perspective that you're trying to draw the figure from. Furthermore, the body parts can then be understood by different angles at which the boxes are basically drawn in or viewed, really breaking up the geometric nature of various body parts. This also allows you to break down the shape of a figure into fundamental form to better understand how its body is shaped in various segments. So this is kind of really creating a doll-like quality in the actual figure, which then can assist you in understanding points of mobility, scale, and unique perspectives. So try to create a figure in a slightly more unique stance or pose by the use of boxes to define different features of the body. Naturally, by the use of three-dimensional shapes, these box-like shapes, we understand not only the fundamental form of various body parts, but we also once again understand how to add shading to these different features. This is where we see those surface areas all facing a single direction can then be established with the same tonal value, and the same can be said with different surface areas facing different angles with different types of tonal values. So another way to approach unique perspective is by using the rule of 8 to develop very simplistic skeletal structures. So this is a different kind of way, kind of following the same format of keeping the structure very simplified. In this case, we are not using boxes or like a box method, but we are using the skeletal structure to basically determine the very unique movements within a figure. And this is very useful for cases for figures in unique poses that define maybe a figure in motion. This can be very helpful. So this is often because a figure in motion will have very distorted body features, especially in the anime genre, with exaggerated features as they shift from one direction to another, or as they shift maybe from the background to the foreground. Now, understanding the proportions can then allow us to understand how to distort them to really emphasize these unique distortions within anime character poses. And this can make them seem more heroic, more swift in their motions, and gives them a very anime-like detailing. This is also a great way of developing a quick sketch of a character in motion. So understanding the skeletal structure and utilizing the rule of 8 to establish proportions can really help you to establish a figure in motion or in a unique pose quite quickly, to then proceed by erasing that light sketch and then refine it by shaping the body around that skeletal form and then slowly refining the anime character thereafter. Now, this is where we start to think once again about the more emphasized bodily features that uniquely define the character. And again, this process is really good for unique movements and characters in motion, specifically with exaggerated movements where they're being very heroic or very swift and basically just drawn in these very crazy poses. So by developing a few characters in this way, we can create unique perspectives and anime character poses. Now that we understand a few methods of character drawings and how to basically construct characters, we can now look at how we can create unique poses with these key concepts. So we're going to explore some unique poses and perspectives. Again, the box method is really good for understanding how shapes shift between different depths of field. So this is because we can see how the shape becomes smaller as it moves away from the foreground. As we shift from the foreground to the background, we can also consider the scale of different features. Naturally, the features will be smaller in the background, but as they shift to the foreground, they will be larger in scale. This means we can keep the rule of 8s to remind us of the scale of different features. However, the length of these 8 segments will distort slightly, become smaller depending on the perspective and how body features shift into the foreground. So naturally, we do want to maintain this quality of keeping the 8 segments, but we do want to play around with distorting them with these very exaggerated poses between body parts that sit in the foreground and ones that sit in the background. So being conscious of depth of field is very important for these kinds of poses, because naturally the actual distortion in the figure needs to seem as seamless as possible and make sense depending on which body parts are positioned in the foreground, and as they shift into the background they'll become slightly smaller. Now naturally, as you gain more confidence, you can then start thinking about the rule of 8 a little more loosely, and this way you can really start to maybe elongate certain body members to really play around with a very unique aesthetic in your anime character design. Now once again, anime characters are always an exaggeration of otherwise normal anatomical structures. In the case of heroic or eccentric movements, this understanding of the rule of 8 is very important. Now this is because it provides us with a lot of freedom to establish a light sketch in the correct form, where we basically establish the character in its skeletal form, And this is where we naturally will utilize the rule of 8, breaking down the body in its various 8 segments, but then we can play around with just establishing the character very lightly in a skeletal structure and then slowly forming the body around that skeletal structure for these very eccentric forms, these very heroic forms, maybe characters in flight and movements such as that. We can then refine said sketch to suit the intended design of the character, and this is just a great way to play around with movement and to do so quite quickly. So you always want to start with a light sketch by breaking down the proportions of various features, and as you do so you can distort them according to how they sit within the various depths of field, and that's where we think about changing the scale of different body parts to suit the seamless transition between foreground and background and creating a more realistic movement in the character. Again, as you get more comfortable, try to challenge yourself further with unique movements and positions within your anime character poses, and we can play around with creating various sketches of characters in different motions for both male and female anime designs. Now this way you do develop a base of anime pose references to basically draw inspiration from. So the idea is to really build up a archive of different poses for both male and female figures, and once you have an understanding of the proportions, you can try unique positions of anime character designs where you play around with these different points of mobility where the character is bent in certain ways, and this is where characters can be drawn maybe sitting, hunched over, maybe in a fighting position, or any kind of movement where those points of mobility in the body, whether it is the knee, the rib cage, the elbows, are really exaggerated in a bending formation. The idea is to basically develop an understanding of these proportions and how they change due to the pose of the character. Having sketches of characters in different poses will also provide you with some anime pose references. Now naturally, as we proceed, once you have gained some confidence, you can then apply these ideas and concepts of form, shape and proportion to slightly more unique character designs, and that is how to develop an anime character pose with a few single key concepts in mind. So the idea is work on some simple anime body poses, figuring out the basics in a few light sketches before moving on. Now once we have this general understanding of these fundamental concepts, we can then move on to creating unique anime characters. Again, the anatomy of anime characters doesn't necessarily differ from normal anatomy, human anatomy. However, we can tweak and change certain aspects to have a slightly more cartoon-like quality and really emphasize the anime genre within the character design. Now, the first thing we're going to do with these various poses is we're going to start with lightly sketching the character form. So let's play around with a few different characters, starting with a male anime character, maybe in a squatting position. And in doing so, this is quite a unique position and it provides us with a really good challenge for drawing this character. So already we can consider the distortions of the various 8 segments that run throughout the body. So once again, the idea is to imagine how the scale of 8 equal segments would move through this posture and thereby